Hey everybody, I'm Joe, and this is Grounded in Fact. In 1965, people marched from Selma to Montgomery for the right to vote. Police met them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with clubs and tear gas. The images were broadcast on national television. 8 days later, President Johnson went before Congress, and later that year, he signed the Voting Rights Act into law. It took 100 years after the end of slavery. It took a constitutional amendment that got ignored for nearly a century. And it took Bloody Sunday. And here's the thing about that march and that law and that law. The people who made it happen were not in Washington. They were in Selma. They were in Birmingham. They were in the Deep South, in the place that had been on the front lines of this fight the longest. The experts, the organizers, the change makers. After many years of chipping away at it, you all remember Shelby County versus Holder, right? The Supreme Court delivered its strongest gut punch yet to the Voting Rights Act on April 29th, 2026, and the now infamous Callais decision. And when I think about who's going to feel that ruling first and feel it the hardest, it's not people up here in Boston. It's not people on the coast. It's the same communities that marched in 1965, the same place that groundwork works alongside every single day. And still, they're not panicking. They're organizing. Before we talk about what this ruling means and what comes next, I think it's worth sitting with what it took to get the protections that we just lost. Because you cannot understand what was taken without understanding what it cost to build it in the first place. And that's what we're going to talk about today. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. It said that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race. Almost immediately, states, mostly in the South, started finding ways around it. They created poll taxes. You had to pay money just to be able to vote. If you couldn't afford it, you couldn't vote. They created literacy tests. You had to read and answer questions to an election official who could decide on the spot that your answers weren't good enough. And if none of that worked, there was always violence, threats, intimidation, people showing up to register and never making it home. A constitutional amendment ignored for nearly a century. By 1940, 70 years after the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution, only 3% of Black Americans in the South were registered to vote. 3%. Things came to a head in 1965. Civil rights activists organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand that Black Americans actually be allowed to vote. On that first march, police attacked the protesters on a bridge with clubs, with tear gas, in front of cameras. The whole country watched on television. That day became known as Bloody Sunday. 8 days later, President Johnson stood before Congress, and he said enough. Later that year, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. And here's what it did. It got rid of literacy tests. It sent federal workers to oversee voter registration in places where Black voters had been blocked. Put the government on watch. And it worked. By the end of that same year, 250,000 new Black voters had registered. For decades, as the forces of disenfranchisement kept pushing, the Voting Rights Act held the line. That is a big part of how Black people built political power across the South. On June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court dealt its greatest blow to the Voting Rights Act. The Shelby County versus Holder ruling blocked the pre-clearance process that for decades had protected Black voters. Pre-clearance meant that regions with a history of discrimination had to get federal approval before changing their voting process. Before they could remove the goalposts, they needed permission. That protection's now gone. Since gutting sections 4 and 5, states have enacted strict voter ID requirements, severe limitations on absentee voting, restrictions on voter registration processes and practices. Sound familiar? Folks, that's the playbook. Too often we've seen regressive policy incubated in an overlooked state, and it slowly, or not so slowly, spreads nationally. Suddenly, people are like, where did this come from? What's happening? Well, it didn't come from nowhere. You just got to know where to look. But even after Shelby, one major protection remained, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The provision that said that you cannot draw a map designed to dilute the voting power of communities of color. You cannot draw people out of political representation. It's the last line of defense. On April 29th, 2026, the Supreme Court came through. So here's the backstory And walk you through this carefully because the details really matter. The dispute began when Louisiana redrew its congressional map after the 2020 census and created just one majority-minority district out of 6. Voters and civil rights organizations sued, arguing that Section 2 required 2 majority-minority districts. Now, Louisiana is a state where Black residents make about 1/3 of the population. One majority Black district out of 6 was not proportional. Courts agreed. Louisiana was ordered to draw a second majority Black district, and they did. Then a group of white plaintiffs sued to stop it. They argued that drawing a district to remedy discrimination was itself discrimination, that fixing a racially biased map was a racial gerrymander. To recap, a state that was required by law to fix a discriminatory map. They fixed it, and they got sued for fixing it. So on April 29th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3, divided along ideological lines. The ruling significantly reworked a 40-year-old framework for Section 2 cases, making 3 changes that collectively make it much harder for Black voters to win cases filed under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The ruling did not technically strike down Section 2, but as a League of Women Voters put it, the court weakened Section 2 to the point of interoperability. Now, this sends a very clear message to the nation. Racial discrimination in redistricting is acceptable when done under the guise of partisan gerrymandering. That is their word. Inoperability. The law still exists, just can't do anything.
Since that decision, of course, Louisiana state leaders decided to rush and redraw maps and in the state legislature, which many civil rights organizations such as Power Coalition had to do quick mobilizations again to get people to educate what's actually happening and to get people to the Capitol to be seen and to be heard.
Now, I want to be really clear about how fast this all moved, because this is not a future threat. This is happening literally right now. The Florida House voted on a new congressional map hours after the Supreme Court issued its ruling gutting the Voting Rights Act. Not days, not weeks, hours. They had a map ready. They were waiting for permission, and Callais gave it to them. The new Florida map would shift 4 U.S. House districts currently represented by Democrats to Republicans. Within days, Republican governors of Alabama and Tennessee called special legislative sessions to consider new congressional maps too. That decision also triggered a special session in Mississippi. Since the Callais ruling, several white Republican-led southern states have rushed to eliminate Black majority districts, including Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee. A report from Black Voters Matter and Fair Fight found that 191 state legislative seats are at risk of elimination, all held by Democrats and mostly Black legislators. The ruling could also create 19 additional safe Republican congressional seats. 35 of the 40 Southern congressional representatives of color were elected from majority-minority districts. 83% of them are Democrats. And I want to be really clear about what that means, because this can get framed as a partisan issue, and I think that misses the point. This is not just about party politics. This is about whether communities of color have representatives who come from those communities, who know those communities, who fight for those communities in places where decisions get made. And when those districts disappear, those communities lose their seat at the table. And the decisions that get made at the table on healthcare, on housing, on wages, education, policing, they get made without them. So how did we get here? How did the most important piece of voting rights legislation get gutted while most of the country wasn't paying attention? The same way it always happens, slowly, in overlooked places across the country. After more than a decade of judicial attacks from the right, Louisiana versus Callais deals a final blow to the VRA. Shelby County in 2013 ended Section 5. Ranovich versus DNC in 2021 limited Section 2. Together, these 3 cases limit minority representation at both the voter and representative level. 3 cases, 13 years. A deliberate, methodical dismantling of the most important voting rights legislation in American history. And every single time, the people who felt it first were in the South, in the deep South, placed the groundwork was alongside every single day. Not Boston, not the coasts. The places where people have been fighting for the right to vote for generations. Senior Trump advisors are telling top GOP donors that the Callais decision is one of the Supreme Court cases they expect to boost Republicans in the 2026 midterms and transform their power to win elections for years. They are saying the quiet part out loud. It is not coincidence. It's a strategy. The people in the communities we work with have seen this strategy before. They know exactly what it looks like.
We're at a point where we're back to Jim Crow. Most people at least recognize what that's all about, and the idea of actually having to think about ourselves being pushed back to Jim Crow is something that they can relate to. Last night, I had a couple of conversations with some youth groups, and they're so upset and concerned that they're ready to go to the polls right now. So it's like I'm saying that's the kind of energy that we've been trying to actually just kind of pull out and actually push forward in Mobile and in other parts of Alabama. The community power that we need is to be that individuals are tired of what they're seeing and feeling and not having, that we need to get out and do something about it. And to have young people stand up and say that has been, just in these last 2 days, has been just for me, has been something that says, yes, we will continue the fight.
What you just heard is exactly what I mean when I talk about following the lead of people who have been doing the work the longest. They're not panicking. They're not frozen. They are organizing. And that is where the hope lives. Look, it feels bleak, and believe me, I get it. I really do. That's often my reaction too. But these folks are experts at facing extremism. When we find ourselves in a moment like this one, where democracy is backsliding, there's threats to feel that are never ending, it benefits us most to listen, to follow the lead of people who have been fighting against these forces the longest. So I encourage you to look up at what is happening with redistricting in your state, your neighborhood, your community right now. There's a good chance that people are already organizing and push back, and even a better chance that those folks have a few simple ways that you can help take action. The Voting Rights Act was built as a promise that the 15th Amendment would finally mean what it said, that essentially poll taxes and literacy tests and violence and intimidation would end. The ballot box would belong to everyone. People marched for that. They bled a bridge in Selma for that. They died for that. And look, I want to share something that happened just weeks after the Callais ruling came down, because I do think it matters. South Carolina lawmakers dealt a real blow to the redistricting push when the state Senate voted against redrawing its congressional map after 3 weeks of debate and rushed hearings. The goal had been to carve up the state's only majority black district. The vote fell short of the 2/3 support needed, with several Republicans crossing the aisle to block it. Think about what that means. In a Republican-controlled legislature, in a deep red southern state, the pressure held. Several Republican senators said the changing map mid-election could disenfranchise voters already casting their ballots. But to be clear, this fight is not over. More states are redrawing maps. But that vote is a reminder that the opposition does not win every round, that organizing works, and that pressure works. That sometimes, if you place it where the deck is most stacked against you, people show up and they hold the line. The people who have been doing this work for generations, places groundwork works alongside every single day. They know how to fight before Callais. They know how to fight after. That is where hope lives. Not in any single ruling or any single vote. The people will keep showing up anyway. Until next time.